Hi YouTube, and welcome back to History for Sleep. Tonight, we leave behind the towering castles, crowded marketplaces, and stone walls of medieval Europe, and travel instead to the quiet rivers that connected the medieval world. Long before bridges crossed every stream and long before roads became safe and reliable, rivers were both lifelines and obstacles. Merchants depended on them. Pilgrims crossed them, messengers hurried along them, armies feared them, and standing between one shore and another was a man whose life was spent upon the water. Tonight, we will follow the lonely life of a medieval ferryman. Imagine a cold morning somewhere in 14th century Europe. A thick blanket of mist drifts across a wide river. The world is silent except for the gentle sound of water moving against a wooden dock. The first rays of sunlight have not yet reached the valley. Most people are still asleep in their homes, yet one man is already awake. He steps from a small riverside cottage and makes his way toward an old wooden ferry tied to the shore. This river has been his workplace for years, perhaps decades. Every morning begins the same way. Every day is shaped by the flow of the water and the arrival of strangers. Travelers may only see him for a few minutes as they cross from one bank to another, but for the ferryman, the river is an entire world. His life is one of routine, patience, and solitude. From dawn until dusk, he transports merchants carrying valuable goods, farmers bringing crops to market, pilgrims traveling toward distant shrines, wandering monks, noblemen on horseback, and ordinary villagers simply trying to reach the opposite shore. Some speak endlessly during the crossing. Others remain silent. Some are kind. Others are impatient. Most will forget the ferryman shortly after stepping onto dry land. Yet he remembers many of them. Over the years, he becomes a witness to countless stories. He hears rumors of wars before they begin. He learns about distant kingdoms he will never visit. He listens to tales of adventure, heartbreak, fortune, and loss. The river brings the world to him even as he rarely leaves its banks. But life beside the water is not always peaceful. Rivers can be unpredictable companions. Gentle currents can become violent floods. Calm mornings can turn into dangerous storms. During winter, ice threatens to trap boats along the shore. During spring, swollen waters can sweep away docks and roads. The ferryman must learn to read the moods of the river as carefully as a sailor reads the sea. One mistake can cost lives. Every crossing carries responsibility. Every journey requires trust. As the years pass, the ferryman watches the world change around him. Children he once ferried across the river return as adults. Young travelers become old men. New rulers appear on distant thrones. Roads improve. Villages grow larger. Yet the river remains much the same. It continues flowing past forests, fields, and hills exactly as it has for centuries. Standing upon his wooden ferry, the ferryman begins to understand something few others ever do. Human lives move quickly, but rivers measure time differently. They witness generations come and go while they continue their endless journey toward the sea. Over the course of tonight's story, we will follow one ferryman from his first uncertain days learning the trade to his final years beside the water. We will experience misty mornings, powerful storms, lonely winters, crowded market days, and quiet evenings beneath the stars. We will meet travelers from every corner of the medieval world and discover what it meant to spend a lifetime carrying strangers across a river while remaining rooted in one place. So settle in, relax, and allow your breathing to slow. Imagine the gentle creaking of an old wooden boat, Picture moonlight reflecting upon dark water. Listen to the distant sound of a river flowing through the medieval countryside. The fog is rising from the water, the ferry is waiting at the dock, and a long journey is about to begin. Tonight, we discover the lonely life of a medieval ferryman. The year is 1342. Dawn has not yet arrived. A pale mist hangs over a broad river winding through the medieval countryside. The water moves slowly and quietly beneath the darkness, reflecting the final stars of the night. On the eastern bank sits a small wooden cottage, weathered by years of rain, wind, and winter frost. Smoke rises gently from its chimney as the first signs of morning begin to appear along the horizon. Inside lives a young boy no older than 15. Unlike most boys his age, he does not work in the fields or learn a trade in a crowded town. His world is smaller, quieter, and defined by the river flowing just beyond his door. Every morning he wakes before sunrise to help his father prepare the ferry. The work is simple but demanding. Ropes must be checked, wooden planks inspected. The small boat must be cleaned and secured before the first travelers arrive. As the boy steps outside into the cold morning air, he pauses for a moment beside the water. The river fascinates him. Some days it appears calm and welcoming. Other days it seems mysterious and endless. He often wonders where the water comes from and where it eventually goes. Travelers tell stories of distant cities, great ports, and vast seas beyond the horizon. The boy has never seen any of these places. Yet through their stories, he imagines a world much larger than the quiet riverbank he calls home. Soon his father emerges from the cottage carrying a lantern. He is a ferryman, as his father was before him. For decades, he has guided people safely across the river. Farmers, merchants, monks, soldiers, pilgrims, and wandering travelers all depend upon him. Without the ferry, reaching the opposite shore would require a dangerous journey many miles away. Together they walk toward the dock where the old wooden ferry waits. The boat creaks softly against its ropes. The river is still hidden beneath layers of silver mist. The boy helps untie the vessel while his father prepares the long pole used to guide it through shallow water. Before long, the first travelers arrive. A farmer carrying sacks of grain, a merchant leading a mule loaded with goods, a monk dressed in simple robes. The boy watches them board the ferry one by one. Each person seems to come from a different life. Each carries different worries, different hopes, and different destinations. Yet for a brief moment, all of them share the same small boat. As the ferry pushes away from shore, the boy listens carefully to their conversations. Merchants discuss market prices. Travelers speak of distant towns. Sometimes rumors of wars and kings drift across the water. The river becomes a place where stories gather. The crossing takes only a few minutes, but the boy treasures every journey. He learns more about the world from these travelers than he ever could from books. As the sun finally rises above the valley, golden light breaks through the morning fog. The river begins to sparkle. Birds circle overhead. Another day has begun. The boy does not know it yet, but this river will shape the rest of his life. Several months pass. Summer settles across the valley. The mornings arrive earlier now, and the river glows beneath warm sunlight. Life continues much as it always has. The boy wakes before dawn. He helps maintain the ferry. He listens to travelers and watches the endless flow of people crossing from one shore to the other. Yet his father has begun teaching him more than simple chores. He teaches him how to judge the river's depth by its color, how to recognize hidden currents, how to steer against the flow without exhausting himself, how to remain calm when frightened passengers panic. Most importantly, he teaches him responsibility. The river is never truly the same, his father often says. Respect it every day. One morning, before the mist has fully lifted, the boy discovers that his father is ill. Nothing serious, but serious enough to keep him indoors for the day. For the first time, the responsibility of operating the ferry falls entirely upon the boy's shoulders. His stomach tightens with nervousness. What if he makes a mistake? What if someone falls into the river? What if the current proves stronger than expected? Soon the first travelers begin arriving. An elderly woman carrying baskets, two merchants with heavily loaded carts, a young pilgrim heading toward a distant monastery. They look at the boy with uncertainty. "Where is your father?" one asks. "He is resting today," the boy replies. "And you'll be taking us across?" The boy nods. The travelers exchange cautious glances. Suddenly, the responsibility feels even heavier. Taking a deep breath, he unties the ferry and guides it away from the dock. The river seems wider than usual. The current feels stronger. Every sound appears louder. The creaking wood beneath his feet, the splash of water against the hull, the nervous shifting of passengers. Yet slowly his training takes over. He remembers his father's lessons. He watches the current, adjusts his position, keeps the ferry balanced. Little by little his confidence grows. Halfway across the river, something unexpected happens. The morning mist begins to thicken. Within minutes, the opposite shore becomes difficult to see. The passengers grow uneasy. The river seems to disappear into a world of white fog. For a moment, fear grips the boy. Then he remembers another lesson. When vision fails, trust what you know. He focuses on the current, on the sound of water, on the familiar feel of the river beneath the boat. Carefully, he continues forward. At last, a dark shape emerges through the mist. The opposite dock. The crossing is successful. The passengers step ashore safely. One of the merchants smiles. "You handled that better than many grown men." The boy feels a rush of pride unlike anything he has experienced before. By evening, he has completed dozens of crossings. When he finally returns home, exhausted but happy, his father listens quietly as he describes the day. Then the old ferryman smiles. For the first time, he sees not a child helping on the river, but the beginning of a ferryman. Several years pass after the boy's first crossing alone. The river remains the center of his world, but he is no longer the nervous apprentice who once feared every current and every patch of morning fog. He has become a skilled young ferryman. Before sunrise each day, he walks down to the dock while mist still hangs above the water. The ferry creaks softly beside the shore, waiting for another day of work. At first, life seems repetitive. The same river, the same boat, the same crossing. Yet the ferryman gradually realizes that while the river remains familiar, the people upon it never do. Every day brings new travelers and new stories. Merchants arrive with wagons full of cloth, spices, and tools. Pilgrims travel toward distant shrines. Messengers ride with urgent news from faraway lords. Wandering monks, hunters, craftsmen, and farmers all pass through his ferry. Some crossings are silent. Others are filled with conversation. The ferryman spends hours listening to stories from places he may never see himself. He hears of bustling cities surrounded by stone walls, ports crowded with ships from distant lands, and castles standing high above mountains. One merchant describes a city so large that thousands of people walk its streets every day. Another traveler speaks of a cathedral whose towers seem to reach the heavens. The ferryman listens carefully to every story. Although he rarely leaves the riverbank, he begins to feel connected to a much larger world. Sometimes, after travelers leave, he finds himself staring across the water and imagining the distant places they described. Yet no matter how fascinating their stories are, he always feels happiest when returning to the familiar rhythm of the river. As the years continue, the ferryman begins noticing how much the river changes throughout the year. During spring, melting snow from distant hills swells the water and strengthens the current. The river becomes wider and more powerful, carrying branches and debris downstream. Summer brings long days and busy crossings. Travelers arrive from dawn until sunset, filling the ferry with life and conversation. The docks remain crowded, and the ferryman rarely finds a moment to rest. Then autumn arrives. Leaves drift across the water and gather along the shore. The air becomes cooler. Morning fog grows thicker. Fewer travelers appear each week. By winter, the valley feels almost deserted. Frost covers the docks before sunrise, and thin sheets of ice form near the riverbanks. Some days only a handful of passengers arrive. The ferryman spends long hours alone, listening to the gentle movement of water beneath the frozen landscape. One evening, after completing his final crossing of the day, he remains on the ferry as the sun slowly disappears behind distant hills. The sky glows gold and orange. The river reflects the fading light like polished glass. For a moment, the entire world feels silent. No travelers, no voices, no footsteps, only the river. Standing there alone, the ferryman realizes something important. While thousands of people will cross the river throughout his lifetime, he is the one who will always remain. Travelers come and go. Seasons change. Years pass. Yet every morning the ferry will still be waiting at the shore, and so will he. The thought feels strangely comforting as darkness settles over the valley and another day upon the river comes to an end. One spring, after an unusually harsh winter, the ferryman awakens to a river unlike any he has seen before. For weeks, snow has been melting in the distant hills and mountains upstream. Day after day, the water rises higher. The calm river he knows so well transforms into a powerful force. Trees, branches, and debris rush downstream at frightening speeds. Sections of the riverbank begin disappearing beneath muddy water. Villagers gather near the shore to watch the swollen river with concern. The ferryman spends his days reinforcing the dock, securing ropes, and checking the ferry for damage. Travelers still need to cross, but every journey now carries greater risk. One morning, a group of merchants arrives with wagons full of valuable goods. They must reach the opposite shore before nightfall. The ferryman studies the current carefully before agreeing. The crossing proves difficult. Strong currents push against the ferry, and waves crash against the wooden hull. For the first time in years, the ferryman truly feels the river testing his skills. Yet through patience and experience, he guides the passengers safely across. When the merchants finally reach the opposite bank, they thank him with genuine relief. That evening, as he watches the roaring river from the dock, the ferryman realizes that no matter how familiar the water seems, it can never be fully controlled. It demands respect every single day. Several months after the floodwaters finally retreat, summer returns to the valley. The river becomes calm once more, and life settles back into its familiar rhythm. One warm afternoon, an unusual traveler arrives at the dock. His clothing is different from anything the ferryman has seen before. His accent sounds unfamiliar. Even the horse he rides appears unlike those used by local villagers. As the ferry crosses the river, the stranger speaks of places so distant they seem almost impossible to imagine. He describes enormous cities beyond mountains, bustling ports filled with ships from foreign lands, and roads stretching farther than the ferryman can comprehend. The ferryman listens with fascination. For years he has heard stories from travelers, but this man's tales seem to come from another world entirely. By the time they reach the opposite shore, the ferryman feels as though he has briefly traveled across half of Europe without ever leaving his boat. The stranger thanks him and continues his journey down the road until he disappears into the distance. Long after he is gone, the ferryman remains standing at the dock watching the horizon. For the first time, he wonders what lies beyond all the rivers, forests, and roads he has known his entire life. Yet as the sun begins to set and another traveler approaches the ferry, he smiles and returns to work. The world may be vast, but somehow it always finds its way to his little stretch of river. Years pass, and the ferryman becomes one of the most trusted men in the valley. Most travelers know his face. Many villagers cannot remember a time when someone else operated the ferry. One autumn afternoon, dark clouds begin gathering above the river. At first, the ferryman thinks it will be an ordinary storm, but as the day continues, the wind grows stronger than usual. By evening, heavy rain begins falling across the valley. Despite the worsening weather, a small group of travelers arrives at the dock. Among them are an elderly couple trying to reach their village before nightfall. The ferryman studies the river carefully. The water remains passable, but conditions are becoming dangerous. Knowing the travelers have nowhere else to go, he agrees to make one final crossing before stopping for the night. Halfway across the river, the storm unleashes its full strength. Rain lashes against the ferry. Powerful gusts push the boat sideways. Waves strike the wooden hull. The passengers grow frightened as thunder echoes through the valley. Yet the ferryman remains calm. Years of experience guide every decision he makes. He adjusts the ferry's course, watches the current closely, and slowly brings the vessel toward the opposite shore. When the passengers finally step onto solid ground, they are shaken but safe. The ferryman returns home soaked from head to toe, exhausted but grateful. That night, listening to the storm outside his cottage, he realizes that courage is not the absence of fear. It is continuing to do one's duty despite it. Several weeks later, the valley looks completely different. The storm has passed, and autumn colors cover the countryside. Golden leaves drift across the river and gather along the shore. The air feels cooler now, and the mornings arrive wrapped in thick silver fog. One particularly quiet morning, very few travelers appear. The ferryman spends hours alone on the dock, listening to the gentle movement of water. Around midday, a young woman arrives carrying a basket of letters. She explains that she delivers messages between villages and has crossed the river many times over the years. During the journey, she tells the ferryman stories about people whose lives have changed because of the letters she carries. Some contain good news, others bring sorrow. As he listens, the ferryman begins thinking about how many lives briefly touch his own before moving on. He may never know what becomes of most travelers after they leave his ferry, yet for a few minutes he becomes part of their journey. When the woman reaches the opposite shore and continues down the road, The ferryman remains watching her disappear into the distance. The river flows quietly beneath the afternoon sun. For the first time in many years, he feels less like a man operating a boat and more like a silent witness to countless human stories. The realization stays with him long after the day ends and the evening mist begins rising from the water once again. Many years have passed since the ferryman first took control of the ferry. His movements have become effortless, almost instinctive. He knows every bend of the river, every change in the current, and every sound the wooden boat makes. One cool spring morning, a young traveler arrives at the dock. At first, he seems like any other passenger. He carries a small pack and wears the clothes of someone who has spent years on the road. But as the ferry begins crossing the river, the traveler smiles and asks whether the ferryman remembers a frightened boy who crossed this river many years ago on his way to become an apprentice in a distant town. Slowly, the ferryman realizes that he does. The traveler had been one of the countless children he had ferried across the river long ago. Now that child has returned as a grown man. During the crossing, the traveler shares stories of the life he built beyond the valley. He speaks of workshops, cities, friendships, and adventures. The ferryman listens with quiet satisfaction. For the first time, he sees the result of a journey that began on his ferry many years earlier. When the traveler reaches the opposite bank and continues toward his childhood village, the ferryman watches him disappear down the road and reflects on how many lives have passed through his boat without him ever knowing what happened afterward. As the years continue, the ferryman becomes something of a local legend. Travelers arriving from nearby villages often hear about him before they ever reach the river. Some speak of his skill during storms. Others tell stories of how he safely guided passengers through floods and harsh winters. One summer afternoon, a group of merchants arrives from a distant region. To the ferryman's surprise, they already know his name. They speak of hearing stories about the dependable ferryman of the valley from travelers many miles away. The ferryman finds the idea amusing. He has spent nearly his entire life on the same stretch of river and has never sought recognition. Yet somehow, his reputation has traveled farther than he ever has. As the merchants cross the river, they ask questions about his life. He answers simply. He tells them about the seasons, the river, and the thousands of people he has carried across the water. Nothing more. When the crossing ends, the merchants thank him and continue their journey. That evening, as the sun sinks below the horizon and golden light reflects across the river, the ferryman sits quietly on the dock. He realizes that while he may never explore distant kingdoms or famous cities, a small part of his story has already traveled there through the countless people who once stepped aboard his ferry. The ferryman is no longer a young man. Years of working beneath sun, rain, wind, and snow have left their marks upon him. His face appears older, his hands rougher, and his hair now shows the first signs of gray. One winter arrives harsher than any he can remember. Week after week, freezing winds sweep through the valley. Snow covers the forests, fields, and roads. Even the river begins to change. Thin sheets of ice form along the banks and grow thicker each day. Travelers become rare. Entire days pass without a single passenger arriving at the dock. For the first time in many years, the ferryman experiences true solitude. Each morning he walks to the river, breaking fresh snow beneath his boots, and studies the frozen water. Some sections remain open, while others are covered in ice. Crossing safely becomes increasingly difficult. One afternoon, a physician arrives urgently needing to reach a village on the opposite shore where several people have fallen ill. Despite the dangerous conditions, the ferryman agrees to help. Together, they carefully navigate through floating ice and freezing currents. The journey is slow and difficult, but they succeed. As the physician disappears into the snowy landscape, the ferryman feels a quiet sense of pride. Even during the harshest winter, the river still depends on him. Months later, winter finally loosens its grip. Snow begins melting in the forests. Birds return to the valley. The frozen edges of the river crack and disappear beneath flowing water. For the first time in many weeks, the ferryman hears familiar sounds again. Wagon wheels, horses, and travelers approaching the dock. One bright spring morning, the ferry becomes busy once more. Farmers head toward market, merchants resume their journeys, and pilgrims continue along distant roads. Standing on the deck, the ferryman realizes how much he missed these simple interactions during the long winter. Among the passengers is a young boy crossing the river with his father. The child asks endless questions about the ferry, the river, and life beside the water. The ferryman smiles because the boy reminds him of himself many years ago. As the crossing ends, the child waves enthusiastically before leaving. The ferryman watches him disappear down the road and feels an unexpected sense of comfort. Seasons change. Winters come and go. Generations grow older. Yet life continues moving forward like the river itself. Standing beneath the warm spring sun, he looks across the water and realizes that although he has spent decades in the same place, he has witnessed an entire world passing before him. By now, nearly 3 decades have passed since the ferryman first began working on the river. The young apprentice who once nervously guided passengers through the morning mist has become a familiar figure to everyone in the valley. Children who crossed the river with their parents now return as adults with families of their own. Seasons have come and gone so many times that the ferryman no longer measures time in years. Instead, he measures it in floods, winters, harvests, and faces. One spring morning, shortly after sunrise, an unusually large group of pilgrims arrives at the dock. They are traveling toward a famous monastery many days away. Some are young and energetic, while others are elderly and move slowly with the help of wooden staffs. Their clothes are dusty from weeks of travel. Despite their exhaustion, they seem cheerful. Because the ferry cannot carry everyone at once, the ferryman spends the entire morning transporting groups back and forth across the river. During each crossing, he listens to their conversations. Some speak of faith and devotion. Others tell stories about the villages they have visited along the way. One elderly pilgrim describes cathedrals so magnificent that sunlight pours through colorful glass and paints entire walls with brilliant colors. Another speaks of mountain monasteries hidden among the clouds. As the day continues, the ferryman notices something unusual. Unlike merchants who often worry about profit or soldiers who discuss conflict, these pilgrims seem content simply to travel. Even after weeks of walking, they remain hopeful and grateful. Late in the afternoon, the final group boards the ferry. Among them is an old woman who thanks the ferryman for helping her continue her journey. She explains that she may never have another chance to make this pilgrimage. The ferryman is surprised by her kindness. To him, he is simply doing the same job he has done every day for years. Yet as he watches the pilgrims disappear along the distant road, he begins to understand that even the smallest journeys can mean everything to someone. For the travelers, the ferry crossing lasts only a few minutes. For some, however, those few minutes become an important part of a much larger story. That evening, sitting beside the river as the sun slowly disappears beyond the hills, the ferryman thinks about all the lives that have touched his own. Thousands of people have stepped onto his ferry. Most are forgotten, yet a few remain in his memory forever. Several more years pass. The ferryman is now entering middle age. His hair contains more gray than brown. His face is lined by decades of wind, sunlight, and river spray, yet he remains strong and dependable. Every morning he rises before dawn. Every evening he secures the ferry before returning to his cottage. The routine has become as natural as breathing. These years are peaceful years. No great floods threaten the valley. No severe winters close the river. Trade remains steady. Harvests are good. Travelers continue arriving each day. Yet something else begins to change. The ferryman notices that fewer journeys feel exciting than they once did. When he was younger, every traveler seemed mysterious. Every story felt extraordinary. Now he has heard thousands of stories. He can often predict what passengers will discuss before they even begin speaking. At first, this realization saddens him. Has the world become less interesting, or has he simply become older? One evening, while carrying a father and young daughter across the river, he discovers the answer. Throughout the crossing, the little girl stares at everything with wonder. She points excitedly at birds flying overhead. She asks questions about the river, the ferry, and the distant forests. To her, everything seems magical. The ferryman smiles. Suddenly, he remembers being that age himself. The world has not changed. He has simply become accustomed to it. After the passengers leave, he remains on the dock long after sunset. The river glows beneath the moonlight. Frogs croak along the shoreline. A gentle breeze moves through the reeds. For the first time in many years, he looks at the river not as a workplace but as a wonder. The water that passes before him tonight is not the same water that flowed yesterday. The river is always changing, just like people, just like life. Standing alone beneath the stars, the ferryman feels grateful. He may never become famous. He may never travel across kingdoms or sail distant seas, but he has spent his life beside something timeless. And somehow that feels like enough. The ferryman is now an older man. More than 40 years have passed since he first stepped onto the ferry as a nervous apprentice. The river has become as familiar to him as his own reflection. He knows every current, every hidden sandbank, every sound the water makes during every season. Yet one summer, a rumor begins spreading among travelers. Merchants speak of local lords discussing the construction of a permanent bridge somewhere near the valley. At first, the ferryman pays little attention. Similar rumors have appeared before and disappeared just as quickly. But as the months pass, more travelers mention the same thing. Engineers have surveyed nearby roads. Nobles have discussed new trade routes. Some believe a bridge could replace the ferry entirely. For the first time in decades, the ferryman wonders what his future might look like without the river crossing that has defined his entire life. As passengers discuss the possibility, many tell him a bridge would make travel easier. Others insist the ferry is faster and more reliable. The ferryman listens quietly. He does not argue. Deep down, he understands that nothing lasts forever. Villages change. Roads change. People change. Why should the ferry be any different? Yet every morning he still walks to the dock before sunrise. He still unties the ropes. He still carries merchants, farmers, pilgrims, and travelers across the water. Months pass, then years. Eventually, the bridge project is abandoned due to cost and difficult terrain. The rumors fade away. The river remains unchanged. One evening, while watching the sunset reflect across the water, the ferryman smiles to himself. He realizes he spent years worrying about a future that never arrived. The ferry remains where it has always been, gently rocking against the dock as another day. Not long after the bridge rumors disappear, the ferryman begins noticing that certain tasks have become more difficult than they once were. He is still capable and respected, but age is impossible to ignore. His shoulders tire more quickly. His hands ache during cold mornings. The river remains the same, but he does not. One autumn morning, a local family asks whether their teenage son might help him around the ferry in exchange for learning the trade. The request immediately reminds the ferryman of his own youth. After some thought, he agrees. The boy arrives before dawn on his first day, eager but inexperienced. He asks endless questions about the river, the ferry, and the travelers. The ferryman finds himself repeating many of the same lessons his father once taught him decades earlier. How to judge the weather by the clouds. How to recognize dangerous currents. How to remain calm when passengers become frightened. How to respect the river without fearing it. As weeks become months, the apprentice grows more confident. The ferryman begins trusting him with greater responsibilities. Travelers start recognizing the young assistant. Some mornings, while watching the boy work, the ferryman feels as though he is looking back through time at his younger self. One quiet evening after the final crossing, the two sit together at the end of the dock watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon. The apprentice talks excitedly about the future, while the ferryman listens. For years he believed his story was simply about a man and a river. Now he realizes it is also about passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Long after he is gone, the ferry will continue. Travelers will still arrive. The river will still flow. And perhaps one day, the young apprentice sitting beside him will become the ferryman that future generations remember. By now, nearly half a century has passed since the ferryman first learned the trade. His hair has turned mostly gray, and deep lines mark his face from years spent beneath sun, wind, rain, and snow. Yet every morning he still wakes before dawn and walks toward the river. The routine feels as natural as breathing. One summer, a surprising thing begins happening. Travelers arriving at the ferry already know who he is. Merchants from distant towns mention hearing stories about the old ferryman of the valley. Pilgrims recognize his name before stepping aboard. Some even seem disappointed when they discover he is simply an ordinary man rather than the legendary figure they imagined. The ferryman finds this amusing. He has never traveled farther than a few neighboring regions, yet somehow stories about him have traveled across roads he has never seen. One afternoon, a wealthy merchant explains that many travelers speak of the ferryman who has safely guided people across the river for decades through floods, storms, harsh winters, and peaceful summers alike. Listening to this, the ferryman feels a strange mixture of pride and humility. He never set out to build a reputation. He simply showed up every day and did his work. As the merchant continues his journey, the ferryman remains standing at the dock watching the road disappear into the distance. For the first time, he realizes that a meaningful life does not always require great adventures. Sometimes simply doing one thing well for many years leaves a mark on the world. As autumn arrives, the apprentice has become a capable young ferryman. He handles many crossings on his own, allowing the old ferryman more opportunities to rest. One evening after the final passengers have departed, The apprentice returns home while the old ferryman remains alone by the river. The sky slowly darkens as stars appear overhead. Moonlight spreads across the water, transforming the river into a silver ribbon winding through the valley. The ferryman sits quietly at the end of the dock, listening to the gentle sounds of the night. Owls call from distant trees. Reeds sway softly in the breeze. Water laps against the wooden posts. Everything feels calm and timeless. Sitting there, he begins remembering the countless years behind him. He remembers his father teaching him how to guide the ferry through fog. He remembers dangerous floods, powerful storms, busy market days, lonely winters, and thousands upon thousands of faces. Most names have been forgotten, but the memories remain. The river has witnessed every chapter of his life. Looking across the moonlit water, the ferryman realizes something he never fully understood when he was younger. The river was never merely his workplace. It was his companion. Through every season of his life, it remained beside him, always moving forward yet somehow always familiar. Long after midnight, he finally rises from the dock and slowly walks toward his cottage. Behind him, the river continues its endless journey toward the sea, just as it has for centuries and just as it will long after he is gone. The ferryman is now an old man. More than 50 years have passed since he first stepped onto the ferry beside his father. His beard has turned completely white, and his hands carry the marks of a lifetime spent working on the river. The apprentice who once asked endless questions is now a grown man, capable of operating the ferry on his own. Yet the old ferryman still insists on helping whenever he can. Then comes a winter unlike any seen in decades. Snow falls earlier than expected and continues for weeks. Bitter winds sweep through the valley day and night. The river itself begins freezing over in places, something the younger villagers have never witnessed before. Travelers become increasingly rare. Entire days pass without a single crossing. Most people remain indoors near warm fires while the ferryman and his apprentice continue checking the ferry every morning. One afternoon, during a heavy snowfall, a desperate traveler arrives seeking passage. His wife is ill in a nearby village across the river. Despite the dangerous conditions, the old ferryman immediately agrees to help. Together, he and his apprentice carefully guide the ferry through floating ice and freezing currents. The journey is slow and exhausting. Every movement requires effort. The cold bites through their clothing. Yet, after years of experience, the ferryman knows exactly how to navigate the winter river. At last, they reach the opposite shore safely. As the traveler rushes toward the distant village, the apprentice looks at the old ferryman with admiration. Even after all these years, the river still trusts him. That night, sitting beside the fire in his cottage, the ferryman realizes this may be the final great winter of his working life. Spring finally arrives, bringing warmth back to the valley. Snow melts from the hills, birds return to the trees, and the river begins flowing freely once again. The old ferryman notices how much easier it has become to watch rather than work. More and more crossings are now handled by his apprentice. Travelers who once knew only one ferryman are becoming familiar with another face. One bright morning, the old ferryman stands on the dock while his apprentice carries passengers across the river without assistance. Merchants laugh and talk aboard the ferry. Farmers guide their animals onto the deck. Everything operates smoothly. Watching from the shore, the old ferryman feels something unexpected. Not sadness, not regret, pride. The lessons passed down from father to son and then from master to apprentice have survived another generation. Later that evening, after the final crossing, the apprentice secures the ferry exactly as the old ferryman taught him years ago. Together they sit on the dock and watch the sunset spread across the water. Neither speaks for a long time. Words are unnecessary. Both understand what is happening. The river is slowly choosing its next ferryman. As darkness settles over the valley, the old ferryman looks across the familiar water and realizes that for the first time in his life, he no longer worries about the future of the ferry. Long after he is gone, travelers will still cross the river, stories will still pass between the shores, and the endless flow of life will continue just as the river always has. The years have become quieter now. The old ferryman no longer wakes before dawn every morning. Most days, his former apprentice handles the crossings while he watches from the shore or sits outside his cottage overlooking the river. His beard is completely white, his movements slower, and the strength that once carried him through storms and floods has gradually faded. Yet his eyes remain fixed on the river, just as they have been for more than half a century. One autumn arrives with unusual beauty. Golden leaves drift across the water. Cool morning fog rolls through the valley. The river moves peacefully beneath pale sunlight. The old ferryman spends many afternoons sitting at the end of the dock, watching travelers come and go. Some recognize him and stop to greet him. Others know his name only through stories. A few are surprised to discover that the legendary ferryman is simply an elderly man who enjoys listening to the river. During these quiet days, memories return often. He remembers standing beside his father before sunrise. He remembers his first crossing alone through thick fog. He remembers floods that threatened the dock, winters that nearly froze the river solid, merchants from distant lands, pilgrims seeking holy places, children who returned years later as adults, and countless faces that appeared briefly before continuing on their journeys. One evening, as the sun begins setting beyond the hills, he realizes that almost every important memory of his life is connected to this river. Other men measured their lives by battles, fortunes, or distant travels. He measured his by crossings, thousands upon thousands of crossings, and somehow that feels enough. As winter approaches, the old ferryman makes a decision. Though he will always love the river, he knows the time has come to leave the ferry entirely in younger hands. Word quietly spreads through nearby villages. Travelers who have known him for years stop by to offer thanks. Some bring gifts, others simply shake his hand. One cold morning, before the first snow of the season arrives, the apprentice asks the old ferryman to join him for one final crossing. Together they step aboard the ferry as the sun rises through a blanket of silver mist. The river is calm, almost as if it understands the importance of the moment. As the ferry glides across the water, the old ferryman looks around carefully. The wooden deck beneath his feet, the familiar current, the distant trees along the shore, the sound of water touching the hull. Everything is exactly as he remembers, yet everything feels different. This is not another ordinary crossing. It is the last one. When they reach the opposite bank, neither man speaks immediately. They simply stand together and look across the river. Finally, the old ferryman smiles. The apprentice no longer feels like an apprentice. He is a ferryman now, a true ferryman. As they return to the dock one final time, the old man feels no sadness, only gratitude. The river gave him a purpose, a home, and a lifetime of stories. And now, just as his father once did, he is passing that life on to the next generation. The river continues flowing quietly beside them, carrying the years away toward the distant sea. Winter passes and spring arrives once more. The valley awakens just as it always has. Birds return to the trees. Fresh grass appears along the riverbanks. Morning mist rises from the water and drifts lazily across the countryside. Yet for the first time in more than 50 years, the old ferryman no longer walks down to the dock before sunrise. Instead, he watches from the small cottage where he spent nearly his entire life. Some mornings he sits by the window with a warm drink in his hands, observing the ferry from a distance. The younger ferryman, once his apprentice, moves confidently between the shores. Travelers continue arriving exactly as they always have. Merchants still complain about road conditions. Pilgrims still tell stories of distant places. Farmers still rush to market before sunset. Life continues. At first, the old ferryman finds this strange. For decades, he believed the river depended on him. Now he realizes the truth. The river never belonged to him. He belonged to the river. And the river was always destined to continue long after his own journey ended. As weeks become months, he spends more time reflecting on the years behind him. He remembers faces he has not thought about for decades. The frightened boy leaving home for the first time. The merchant who spoke of distant cities. The pilgrims crossing during spring mornings. The travelers caught in storms. The children who returned years later as adults. Thousands of lives. Thousands of journeys. Each one lasting only a few minutes on his ferry. Yet together they formed the story of his life. One quiet evening, near the end of summer, he slowly walks to the riverbank alone. The sun is beginning to set. Golden light dances across the water. The ferry can be seen in the distance carrying passengers toward the opposite shore. The old ferryman lowers himself onto a weathered wooden bench and simply watches. No responsibilities, no passengers waiting, no ropes to untie, no schedules to keep. For the first time since childhood, he has nowhere he needs to be. The realization feels peaceful. As darkness slowly settles over the valley, he listens to the familiar sounds of water moving past the shore. The river sounds exactly as it did when he was a boy. Exactly as it did when his father stood beside him. Exactly as it did during every season of his life. The world around it has changed. People have changed. Kingdoms have changed. But the river continues. Endless. Patient. Unconcerned with the passing of years. The old ferryman smiles. He finally understands why he never left. He spent his entire life searching for meaning without realizing it had been flowing beside him all along. Several years pass. The old ferryman grows weaker with age. His walks become shorter. His days become quieter. Yet whenever weather permits, he still visits the river. The younger ferryman often finds him sitting near the dock, watching the water with the same calm expression he has worn for decades. One autumn morning, a thick blanket of mist covers the valley. It reminds the old man of countless mornings from long ago. The air is cool. The river is silent. Even the birds seem reluctant to disturb the peace. The younger ferryman joins him on the dock. For a long time, neither speaks. They simply watch the water together. Finally, the younger man thanks him, not only for teaching him the trade, not only for teaching him about currents, weather, and boats, but for teaching him patience, responsibility, humility. The old ferryman smiles. Then he looks out across the river one final time. The same river he crossed thousands upon thousands of times. The same river that carried strangers, stories, hopes, fears, dreams, and entire lifetimes from one shore to another. He realizes something beautiful. Every traveler believed they were crossing the river, but in truth, the river had been carrying him all along. From childhood to adulthood, from youth to old age, from beginning to end, the ferry was never merely a boat. It was the bridge between the chapters of his life. As the sun slowly burns away the morning mist, the valley begins to glow with warm golden light. The younger ferryman rises and prepares for another day of crossings. Travelers are already arriving. The river is already calling. Life continues. The old ferryman watches with quiet satisfaction. There is no sadness, no regret, only gratitude for the river, for the people, for the years, for the countless stories that briefly entered his life before drifting onward like water toward the sea. And as the ferry glides across the shining river once more, the old ferryman closes his eyes and listens. The gentle splash of water, the creak of wood, the distant voices of travelers, the sounds that defined an entire lifetime. The river keeps flowing, the ferry keeps moving, the stories keep coming, and somewhere beyond the morning mist, one journey quietly ends as another begins. The end.